Excellencies, distinguished guests, good afternoon. And firstly, just to reiterate my congratulations on the announcement of the AI University. That is absolutely fantastic news, and we look forward to hearing more about that in due course, but that is great news for the UAE. My presentation this afternoon is going to be addressing the topic of bias, and specifically algorithmic bias, and the dangers and risks that it causes. So we'll be looking at what bias is and what it means in an AI context, and we will look at a few real-life examples of where bias has affected AI. We will look specifically at the concept of algorithmic bias, which is quite a technical concept, but I will do my best to explain that to you. And finally, we will look at ways in which bias can be reduced and the harmful effects of it mitigated. So let's look firstly at trying to understand what bias is. Now, I don't often refer to Wikipedia pages, but this one really captured my interest. If you go to the Wikipedia page on bias, you see no fewer than 36 different types of bias. That reflects the fact that bias is an incredibly difficult and complicated concept. And the fact there are 36 different biases on this page tells us two things. The first is that we need to be careful when using the term bias. And second, we need to be accurate when using the term bias. Because if we use the wrong language to describe a problem, then there is a risk that we are either understating the problem or perhaps even overstating the problem. Now, I think that bias is often used to mean the same as prejudice. And prejudice means treating people unequally based on a characteristic. That could be their age, or gender, or race, or ethnicity. For example, if in a particular jurisdiction the police are more likely to stop drivers of an ethnic minority, then we might perhaps say that the police are biased against that ethnic minority. And this definition of bias reflects our understanding and reference to a standard of fairness that we have in society. For example, most societies embrace the concept of gender equality, racial equality. But there are a few issues with this definition. It presupposes that we all have the same standard of fairness, but that is not true. All across the world, there are cultural differences that account for varying degrees and varying standards of fairness. And the second issue, which is really what I want to focus on today, is that bias or prejudice in this context refers to the impact of the particular decision. We say that the decision has an unfair or an unequal impact. But that definition and concept does not reflect or capture any issues in the decision-making process. And it's in the decision-making process where I think algorithmic bias in particular is an issue. And I will come on to explain that in more detail. So I have used two terms here, output bias and algorithmic bias. Now, not everyone in the AI community will use those terms. Maybe I will set a trend here today, who knows? But I think it's important to distinguish between these two concepts. Output bias is about the bias or prejudice which can result from a particular decision. So this is the prejudice and bias concept we've been talking about based on gender, age, race equality. But algorithmic bias is also an issue when it comes to AI. And algorithmic bias is about an issue that occurs in the AI decision-making process. And it's perhaps an issue with the data, or an issue in training the machine learning system, Or it's perhaps an issue in how the AI model is itself operating on a day-to-day basis. And algorithmic bias reflects the more scientific or statistical understanding of what bias is. So if we remind ourselves of how an AI system works, when we give the AI system some data, it finds patterns in the data. And the way it does that is by identifying certain considerations or features in the data, and it places a certain weight on each of those features. So coming back to Mr. Tanna's useful example yesterday of a turtle, and he explained how a machine learning system would identify a turtle, perhaps when looking at lots of different pictures of other animals. And what the system would do is to identify certain features, maybe the head of the turtle, the legs, the shell, and it would attribute a weight to each of those features in order to decide if what it is looking at is indeed a turtle. But let's see how that could go wrong. Let's say the AI system takes into account irrelevant considerations. What if it takes into account the fact that the animal it is looking at has eyes? That might not help the AI system because many animals have eyes. Or it might fail to take into account a relevant feature, for example, the shell. Now, if the AI system ignores the shell, it might find it very difficult to identify the turtle. Or it could fail to take into account enough considerations. Maybe it only focuses on the eyes and the legs. Again, if it doesn't look at the shell, for example, it might find it difficult to identify the animal as a turtle. Or it could place undue weight on certain features and not enough weight on other features. So if the AI system focuses too much on the eyes and the legs and not enough on the shell, which we would say is a distinctive feature of a turtle, then it might, again, not reach an accurate decision. And this is where algorithmic bias is really important. It is something that's going wrong with the actual process that could lead to some sort of inaccuracy in the system. And so algorithmic bias is important for that reason. It represents an issue in the decision-making process of the AI system, and it means that the output or decision of the AI system is perhaps less accurate than it should be. Now, it's also important because algorithmic bias can often lead to output bias. So where there is something wrong in the underlying data, often that could lead to a decision which is contrary to gender equality or race equality, and we'll come on to see that in some examples we look at. Now, algorithmic bias is a particular issue in AI systems because, as we've discussed, AI systems rely heavily on data. And if there is something wrong with that data, then it infects the whole AI system. AI systems also operate, as we've seen, with little human oversight or intervention. And so sometimes, and particularly given that AI systems sometimes operate in a black box, we as humans may not be able to easily tell when the AI system is suffering from some algorithmic bias. And specifically in a supervised machine learning system, humans are able to train the machine learning system. But if the humans themselves have some sort of bias, or the training data they use to train the system is biased in some way, then again, that will infect the whole system. Now, before we look at some examples, I just want to briefly note, because we've been discussing it today, the regulatory angle when it comes to bias. So I'm sure many of you are aware, we see the concept of bias and non-discrimination in certain types of legislation and regulation. For example, in employment or labor law, there is often a principle in jurisdictions to say that we shouldn't discriminate against particular genders, ages, races when it comes to employment. And we've discussed today that actually there is not much regulation globally surrounding AI yet. Most of the commentary so far is around ethical principles and ethical guidance. But it's interesting that in that ethical guidance, you will tend to see a reference to non-discrimination and concern about bias. So, for example, in the OECD Principles on Artificial Intelligence, they say that AI should respect the principle of non-discrimination. And in the high-level ethics guidelines that Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Tanna were discussing earlier, one of the principles is diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. So this is a concept that we do see in ethical guidance, and I'm sure it will be covered in regulation in the years to come. So let's look at a few examples of bias in an AI context. Now, those of you who use Facebook may have seen that Facebook gives you very specific targeted adverts. And Facebook sometimes offers adverts for jobs. And a study in the US found that adverts for school teachers and secretaries were shown more to women than they were to men. And adverts for jobs in the AI industry were shown to more men than to women. And so I'm sure you'll all agree that is an example of gender inequality that we would perhaps want to remove. But the interesting thing about that example is that Facebook and the AI system that's using is being used by Facebook and deciding which jobs to target to which people is based on the data of people clicking on the adverts themselves. So the reason why the AI system is showing more adverts for school teachers and secretaries to females is because in the AI system's data, it sees that more females click on those adverts. So from an algorithmic bias perspective, the AI system is probably working quite accurately. But the issue we have is that there is still output bias from the use of the AI system. There is still some element of prejudice there. And so what that shows us is, even when an AI system may be working technically accurately, it can still cause issues. The second example was by an MIT researcher, and she analyzed 3 facial recognition systems that are being offered in the market today. And she found that generally, the error rates in the facial recognition software were less than 1%. So overall, the facial recognition software was working quite well. But when it came to recognizing females with darker skin, she found that the error rates were between 20 and 34%. The AI system wasn't working properly when it came to recognizing darker-skinned females. And the researcher looked at the underlying data, and in particular, the data on which the software was trained. And she found that in that software, most of the faces which were used to train the AI system were male faces. And she found that most of the training data contained lighter-skinned faces. So her conclusion, which is absolutely right, is that an issue in the training data led to an issue in how the AI system operated in real life. Now, that is an example of algorithmic bias because the system itself, the process itself, is infected with some sort of bias that means it doesn't work accurately. And importantly, in this case, the algorithmic bias led to output bias, some prejudice in the decision of the AI system. The third example I want to mention is Amazon. So Amazon offer a Prime service whereby you can have next-day or even same-day delivery of products. And they launched this system in the US, and they used an AI system to identify the areas in which the service should be offered. The AI system concluded that certain areas should not be offered the Prime system. As it happened, those were areas in which there was an abundance of ethnic minority inhabitants. So again, we see that there's some sort of issue here. Ethnic minority groups are being deprived of the chance to use the Amazon Prime system. But the AI system was working accurately. The reason it excluded those areas was because it concluded that Amazon was not going to make a profit if it offered that service to those areas. Now, that's presumably helpful to Amazon in some ways, and I don't think you can fairly criticize the AI system for coming to that conclusion. But again, even though there may not be any algorithmic bias there, even though the AI system may have been working accurately, there is still a problem with the output. There is still a problem of inequality and prejudice in the output. Now, to understand algorithmic bias a bit more, I want to introduce you to an AI system that we're going to create now. And the AI system is an AI job application review system called AJARS. And let's assume we are all the company that is going to use this AI system. And we want to create a system which reviews candidates' applications for a job and scores the application out of 100. So we, as the designers, need to decide what training data to use, what considerations or features we ask the system to take into account, and what algorithm to use. So let's think about the training data. Well, in our company, we have 50 examples of applications that have been manually scored by our recruitment department. So why don't we give those to the AI system as training material? And hopefully, the AI system can learn from those applications that have already been scored. And what features or considerations should we ask the AI system to consider? Well, on the job application forms, candidates will list their IQ, their university results, their gender, and their age. So let's start with that for a moment. Now, you're probably all bored of this diagram that I've referred to many times over the past 2 days. We have an algorithm, which is the instructions that we give to the AI system. And in this case, the instructions are to review and score the new applications that are submitted by job applicants. We then have a training phase, and the way we are going to train our system is to provide it with 50 examples of applications that have already been scored. And then we're going to let the AI model work itself. It is going to review hundreds and hundreds of new applications, and it is going to score them itself. Now, there are 5 issues, and this is before we talk about output bias or prejudice. There are 5 issues which could go wrong, and which I think are examples of algorithmic bias. AJARS could incorporate insufficient training data. The training data may not be diverse enough. Maybe AJARS takes into account irrelevant considerations. Maybe it doesn't give enough weight to certain considerations. And maybe we use an oversimplistic algorithm. And these issues could lead to 2 things. One, we might have an inaccurate AI system. And that's a problem, because the reason we're entrusting this job to AI is because it can do the job quicker than humans, but it must be able to do it at least as accurately as humans. But secondly, there is a risk, of course, that this job application review system results in prejudice or discrimination against people. So let's look quickly at what this means in practice. And forgive me, this is going to be a little bit technical, but hopefully it helps to explain what algorithmic bias is and how things can go wrong in the decision-making process. Now, if we give the system too little training data, the pattern it will identify will be oversimplistic. We haven't given enough data to the system to be able to properly analyze scores and come up with a realistic pattern. Conversely, if we give too much training data to the system, it won't be able to find a pattern. And if it can't find a pattern, then using the AI system in practice is not going to work. The second issue, if in the 50 examples we gave to the system to say, please learn how to score application forms, let's say 40 of the applicants were male and only 10 were female. There is a risk that AJARS, our AI system, will think that females are unsuitable for the job. Now, that is obviously not a conclusion we want the AI system to reach. This is like the facial recognition example that the MIT researcher looked into. We have to be sure that the training data we give to the AI model is reliable and equal, because any issues with that data will infect the whole of the system. And what about if, in the 50 examples we give, the females happen to score higher than the males? There is a risk that AGAs will say, well, if there is a female applying for a job, she must be scored higher than a male, because that is the data on which I was trained. Now, the obvious solution to that is to remove gender from the AI model. Take away the AI system's ability to distinguish males from females. And I would say that could be a good start. But at the very least, we have to be sure that the data we are giving to the system is equal and varied. Now, let's say that the AI system can find a pattern between university results, but it can't find a pattern between IQ and the scoring of the system. We might have a candidate with a very high IQ, but with very low university results. And AGAs might score the application very low because it hasn't been able to find a pattern. Now, this again exemplifies that you need to give the right data to the AI model, and you need to give it data in a way in which it can learn from the data and find a pattern. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly about how we reduce bias completely. Now, where an AI model results in prejudice, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, or other discrimination, I think it's absolutely vital that we take action. We can't have AI models causing more prejudice than exists in society today. That's output bias. When it comes to algorithmic bias, no data is statistically perfect, and not every AI system is going to be perfect. And this is a point we discussed earlier. We have to accept that AI systems may not be perfect, but if they are better than humans, then surely there is some merit in keeping them, even though they are not perfect. Now, it's not always easy to identify bias, and it's particularly difficult where we have very complex AI models. How do you look inside the black box of an AI system and work out if it's causing bias? Now, if you look at the output of the AI system and it's causing racial or gender discrimination, then there is obviously something wrong. And in those circumstances, we have to look closer at the AI system. Now, one solution would be to what's called open up the black box. And this is something that's discussed quite often in the AI world. And that would be forcing companies to show exactly how their AI systems are working. But there are two issues with that. Is it even possible to open up the black box and in all cases work out how the AI system is operating? Probably not. And the second issue is companies will want to protect their algorithms, their models, and they won't want to disclose how their AI systems are operating. That's how they are succeeding and making money. So we have to ask whether it's fair that we ask companies to open up their black boxes. Now, one solution that Mr. Tanna mentioned earlier is counterfactuals. And that's a particularly helpful way of assessing bias in a system like AGAs. Let's say we have a candidate that achieves a very low score, and we want to find out why. What we could do is change one aspect of the application form and see how the AI system scores the application. So let's say we change the age. If the score changes when we change the age, then we know that the AI system is taking into account the age of the applicant. And you may or may not agree, but I think that's an issue. So we can then look at the AI system and say, why are you taking into account age? And that will help us to identify the issue and hopefully resolve it. A key point which I must emphasize is that all of this represents the problem about data. And we have to make sure that the data we use in an AI system, and that means both the training data, if you're using a supervised machine learning system, but also the underlying data that the AI system uses to make decisions has integrity. We need to make sure that there's no bias already in the data that we use. So if you are presenting data to an AI system, you have to make sure that that data is sufficiently varied and that it allows the AI system to operate as it should. Many issues of AI going wrong are because of the data. There is something wrong with the data. And the data is the bit that, as humans, we have some control over. Training and monitoring is also key. We discussed this earlier today. We have to keep training, we have to keep monitoring, we have to keep checking that the AI system is working as it should be. It is vital that there is human oversight in the operation of an AI system. There was some concern today, I hear from the questions, about whether AI systems are going to replace judges in judicial decision-making. Even if we get to that stage, we cannot remove human oversight in the process. We still have to make sure that humans are still involved in some way, whether it's checking each decision of the AI system, or whether it's regularly monitoring the data and checking for any bias or discrimination. No, I won't go into too much detail on this, but we also have to choose an appropriate algorithm. That means choosing the right set of instructions to give to the AI model. And a lot of discussion in the AI world at the moment is, how do you find the right algorithm? How do you give the right instructions to the AI model to make sure it operates as you want it to operate? There are many different algorithms you could choose. The skill is choosing the right one for your data and your AI system. One other point to mention is that we are seeing other AI systems being used to check for bias. So IBM has an AI fairness tool, which it applies to its own AI models to check for any bias. Just this week, the company DeepMind released new technology which is intended to check for bias in AI systems. I think that's incredibly helpful, but we must always remember, again, there should be some human involvement in checking for bias, because as humans, we know what is fair, we know what is right, and so we should have some involvement. And finally, regulatory intervention. That has been a subject of discussion today in the presentations we've seen, and I think that there should definitely be some consideration of using regulation to remove or at least control bias in AI systems. We could, for example, introduce regulation to make sure that certain characteristics and features are not used by the AI system. For example, should we take out gender and age from an AI system that is reviewing job application forms? I think that is certainly one way that you could reduce the possibility of age or gender or racial discrimination. I think there could be obligations on companies to monitor and test their AI systems on a regular basis using counterfactuals or other techniques. And perhaps it is more drastic, but there could be regulation preventing the use of AI in certain functions. Recruitment, for example. There may be a good argument to say that AI just shouldn't be used in the world of recruitment. And I'll leave you by referring to a proposed Algorithmic Accountability Act in the United States, which may become law, it may not become law, but the current draft of the bill says that companies may have to undertake an automated decision system impact assessment, which means that companies may have to test their AI systems, and one of the things they will be testing for is fairness, bias, and discrimination. And I expect that we will see more proposals for regulation like that in the future to control for both output bias and algorithmic bias, but particularly output bias, because we don't want our AI systems perpetuating or creating issues of gender inequality, race inequality, or any other inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much for, again, a very clear presentation. I have a question concerning the judiciary. My name is Nico Tuin. I'm a judge in the Netherlands, and I have faced the last decade many developments, huge developments, thinking of forensic sciences, IT, globalization, and so on. Now, AI is coming up. And my question to you is, what do you expect to be the role of experts in court for the court decision-making process? Because for a judge, it will be often a black box. The judge, she or he, cannot see how the data were, how the algorithms are. There will be pleadings of it's reliable or not. How can you tell? And what would be the role of experts then? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a very good question. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit of an idealist, but I think where we're seeing initial regulation go is towards concepts like transparency and explainability. And I think the hope is, before we get too carried away with all of the technology and we start seeing lots of cases arise regarding AI, we get to a scenario where actually companies and other users of AI are legally obliged to explain how they are using AI and to make their use of AI transparent. So my hope is that when we get cases involving AI in the next few years, we will all have an understanding of how the AI is being used in that particular context, because there is already a pre-existing obligation on the particular person to explain their use of AI. Having said that, of course, we can't expect judges, just like we can't expect everyone to become experts in AI. So where there is a legal case involving AI, I expect that the role of expert will be significant. We will need to rely on people who understand AI a lot better than us to act as experts in court proceedings, in the same way as now. If you have a complicated financial dispute, for example, you will need to get experts who understand the particular concepts that are being used to appear in court and provide expert evidence on how the technology is being used. Of course, the final point to say is that if we are operating in a black box, then maybe even an expert won't be able to properly explain to the court how AI is being used in a particular case. But we may get to a situation where that will count against a company. So if a company is being sued for its use of AI and the case relates to aspects of the black box, then we will look to the company to say, if you want to defend yourself, you may well have to explain and disclose elements of your AI system and the black box inside it. And if you can't, that may be held against it.
Thank you very much for your speech. After 2 days of discussion, personally, I think my idea is that there are very good chances for having artificial intelligence as an aid, as an assistant for the judge, while I'm still skeptic about the possibility of having a judge bot. Because if we consider that the trial is collecting evidence, and collecting evidence is a kind of dialectic process among human people in which the emotional and the empathy is crucial. And how the judge behave has a direct effect on the way of how witnesses refer to the jury and so on. And applying the law is not just finding the right law, but it is also a question of balancing different principles. So this is not proper only a question on which is the right law, but which is the hierarchy between principle, and there is a circular reasoning between fact and principle, and there is an evolution, and these require a moral liability. While a legal liability is possible to say the liability of the automatic robotic decision is of the state. But can the artificial intelligence have an ethic? Which ethic? Its own ethic, its own moral, is the one who the instructor gave? Yesterday, the speaker made the example of the game AlphaGo. So the game AlphaGo won because he invented a new rule. But the artificial intelligence can give the rule created by human, but can be really, to be independent, it must have the possibility to create a new rule for making a decision. But could be this acceptable by the citizen? It's a question of legitimacy, of faith in justice. And this process, this passage from doing a statistic on which is the percentage of possibility that people killed that man, and the decision, is he that he killed that man, is not just a question, a technical question, but it's a question of assumption of a responsibility, not legal responsibility, not only legal responsibility. And I'm skeptic about the possibility to give to the machine this section, which is crucial, of a decision. Maybe this discussion is too early to do this kind of discussion, but this is the direction where we are going. So if we can take an administrative decision, a labor decision, 100% automatically, can we do a decision that involves moral principles of the moral principle of single people, of being, can be really accepted? I don't want to discuss it, but we can transfer this discussion on war and army decisions. Maybe a machine is better than a human, but a human has to take the political and the moral responsibility of the decision. And this is necessary to be accepted by the people and all their countries. Thank you.
Thank you. There are a lot of interesting points there. I'd just like to pick up on three of those and mention 3 points. The first is, as we've discussed today, and Professor Donati explained a very good example, which is, do we really trust AI currently, and will we trust AI in the future to make judicial decisions on very human-centric aspects? And Professor Donati gave the example of a family case, so where a judge is required to make difficult decisions about custody of children. And we will all have probably some doubt in our mind about whether an AI system is capable of understanding the really human elements of an aspect like that and making, as you rightly say, the correct moral decision, which as a society we would want to see. So I think that's a definite fear in society which we will have to address before AI becomes too involved in judicial decision-making. The second point is, of course it's open to us as humans to allow AI to make those sorts of decisions, and we can give the data to the AI system. We could give hundreds and thousands of previous family law decisions to the AI system to say, go and learn how judges in the past have made difficult decisions in, for example, family law cases. But there are two issues there. One, as we've seen from the AlphaGo example, is that an AI system might find a new way of making a decision. And a new way of making a decision in a judicial context is a risk, because the AI might decide for itself, these moral standards will be best protected by this particular decision, in the same way that in the AlphaGo game, the AI decided I can best win the game by doing something like this. And it was a very unusual move, and no one could have foreseen it. And so if there's a risk that an AI will do unusual things and unforeseeable things in a judicial context, that is a risk. The other risk, of course, is that when we give the data to the AI system as humans, we will have to make sure that that data is itself fair and equal. Because if we only give it judicial decisions from the past, where, for example, someone has received the maximum sentence for murder each time, then the AI system will think that that is normal. So again, the risk in giving too much power to AI is that we don't give it enough or the right data to be able to make a fair decision. Okay, I don't think we've got any more time for questions, but I'm here all day and happy to discuss anything. Thank you.